Hello there everyone, welcome to the channel if you're new, welcome back if you are not. I am EDJ, and we are continuing with Historymarche's Napoleon's strategy in Russia. So part 1 we got a lot of insight as to why Napoleon was kind of, in this invasion in particular, not performing as impeccably as you would expect Napoleon to perform. And you know, there are many factors, obviously. Miscoordination between his underlings, the speeds, relying on supply trains that were ill-suited for how the way Napoleon usually conducted his war. I personally think also it's just the logistics, man. You know, logistics is very underrated, but logistics could make or break wars, right? And, I think Napoleon, I think Napoleon, in my opinion, works better when he has less, if that makes sense. You know, I think if he had gone in with the normal Grand Army size, 100 to 200,000, he may have done better. Or at least maybe not invade Russia, but, I don't know, I just think he works better when he has less, if that makes sense, because he's able to do what you expect more from Napoleon: speed, maneuverability, everything that makes Napoleon Napoleon. And he didn't have that this much in this campaign. And I think, in my opinion, it's just logistics, you know, having to manage the biggest army ever fielded. I imagine it's not an easy task, you know. I imagine they were dealing with a beast that they weren't familiar with, you know. I think Napoleon's main logistics dude was Berthier, Marshal Berthier. I imagine he must have been tearing his hair out at the stress of trying to manage everything. And Napoleon, you know, obviously, as great as he is, has never managed a force this massive. No one has. So I imagine that there was a lot of logistical issues that came. And, yeah, I guess you can kind of see the importance of it, right? In this, warfare. I don't know. But it'll be interesting seeing a bit more about Napoleon. So, yeah, if you want to watch the original video, link down below. Without any further ado, let's watch Napoleon's strategy in Russia Part 2, Attack on Moscow.
Napoleon's central army, including Davout's corps, now numbered around 200,000 men, compared to the 125,000 of the First and Second Russian armies. Not counting the units that had been detached for garrisons and flank guards, the French had already lost around 100,000 to disease, fatigue, and desertion. But this was far less than what de Tolly expected, and in fact the Russians had largely lost the Dvina-Dnieper line, which their initial strategy hinged on. For his part, Napoleon was surely disappointed in the failure of his maneuvers, the quality of his soldiers and generals, and perhaps his inability to personally manage such a tremendous operation. But one thing the Emperor could hardly blame was his supply system, which had largely preserved an army that, in terms of numbers and condition, now posed a far greater threat to Moscow than the Swedes of Charles XII.
This episode is brought to you by Curiosity.
On the Russian side, First and Second Armies finally joined at Smolensk, historically the western gateway to Moscow. But criticism of de Tolly was mounting, most notably from Bagration himself, who complained directly to Tsar Alexander. Realizing that de Tolly's withdrawals were undermining his political credibility, the Tsar now reversed course and demanded aggression against Napoleon. By mid-August, de Tolly dutifully began seeking battle outside the city, though his unenthusiasm was evident through his cautious, halting movements. He was right to be careful. Once Napoleon learnt of the Russian advance, he immediately prepared another maneuver to trap the Russian armies. Gathering his 200,000 men, the Emperor planned to lure de Tolly back to Vitebsk, while his force would wheel around, capture Smolensk, and block the Russians from withdrawing to Moscow. Things started off promisingly, with the Grande Armée achieving operational surprise as it swept up the Smolensk road. But then the French cavalry vanguard met a detachment from Second Army, and it all fell apart. Repeated and wasteful charges failed to destroy the Russians, who ran back to Smolensk and raised the alarm. Having failed to supervise the action again, the Emperor also failed to treat the Russian alarm with appropriate urgency.
Yes, Yeah, he mentioned last video, Napoleon not supervising at times didn't help. And yeah, I think some of his underlings could do well independently, you know, some of the marshals, but others succeed better under Napoleon's guidance. And yeah, some of the people, a lot of Napoleon's maneuvers this campaign so far have not worked, and I think it's mainly because of the people under him not being able to pull off his plans as well. So yeah, maybe he should have taken that, yeah, maybe he should have put a more hands-on approach to certain areas, you know? I think urgency is the key word. Wait, let me hear that one more time.
The Emperor also failed to treat the Russian alarm with appropriate urgency.
Yeah, when we were watching the Epic History TV telling, I felt like I had said that at certain points, Napoleon, I feel like, is lacking certain urgency in regards to, you know, the Russian invasion. Not to say he's not taking it seriously at all, but at certain points, especially with the loss of so many people, the, you know, the coming of winter, which I think even he must have been aware of, and, you know, all the disasters that are kind of happening even before he has the Battle of Borodino. It seems like, yeah, at certain points, Napoleon's not really... I guess he's not taking the potential disaster that's coming, like with the utmost urgency. Not to say he was blind to what's going on, I think urgency is the key word. This should have been more urgent as he's seeing things not going well, but I don't know.
As a result, by the time the French reached Smolensk, the Russian armies were also there and had installed a strong garrison inside. Foiled, a frustrated Napoleon decided to force his decisive battle by assaulting Smolensk directly and bloodily. De Tolly refused to take the bait and ordered another withdrawal from Smolensk, prompting furious accusations of cowardice and treason. Bagration, in particular, stormed off with Second Army, accidentally re-separating himself from First right before Napoleon's eyes. Very luckily for the Russians, those eyes were closed as the Emperor was asleep, and the local French corps failed to show initiative by moving into the space. By the time the French realized the lost opportunity, it had passed them by along.
Napoleon is defeated by sleep. I did not know that. I didn't know he was asleep while this was happening. Another missed opportunity, unfortunately, right? I guess the way you just said it, it seems like some people noticed, but I don't know if they tried to warn Napoleon and just didn't get to him in time, but yeah, that seems like another missed opportunity. And man, Napoleon's luck is like, it's almost like this campaign in particular, like a lot of Napoleon's luck from the previous campaigns are kind of starting, like, running out, you notice? Like, there's a lot of bad luck going on right here on his camp.
Alongside First Army. Napoleon now had to make a decision. Moscow was next after Smolensk, and the Russians would surely defend it in battle. But there were only 2 months left in the regular campaign season, and one would be spent marching to and from the city alone. Alternatively, the French could halt at Smolensk, reorganize themselves, and wait until mid-1813 to lunge at Russia's spiritual capital.
Yeah, this was another thing, right? Like, I remember when we were covering the Epic History TV telling that, it suggested maybe Napoleon should have waited at Smolensk, kind of, I guess, wait there until then. I don't know, what do you guys think? You think Napoleon should have waited? You think that would have even made a difference? Because, he goes to Moscow, but obviously he can't stay there because the city's burned. And then that kind of, him also waiting for the Tsar's reply, ends up making him having to go through the, awful winter retreat, so... Yeah, you think that was possible to avoid? I almost don't know. Like, I'm almost like, yeah, I guess with some hindsight, yeah, maybe he should have waited in Smolensk, but... I don't know. Who knows?
The first option was a big risk, but the rewards were potentially decisive. Napoleon would be battling against a confused and demoralized enemy, instead of a refreshed and reinforced one in 1813. Forcing a decision now would also prevent a Russian winter offensive like in 1807, and moreover, 1807 also showed that even a half-complete victory could get the weak Tsar to accept terms. And so, not for the first nor last time, Napoleon decided that risky action was the way, and in late August, set out for Moscow with 150,000 troops. The Tsar was also making a decision. The virulent criticism against Napoleon after Smolensk made it impossible to keep him in command. The Tsar needed somebody whose popularity, seniority, and ethnicity made him beyond question.
Kutuzov? Is Kutuzov coming back?
There was really only one person who was fit, and so in mid-August, Kutuzov was appointed as commander-in-chief of the combined Russian force, now 150,000 strong. Confusingly, Napoleon and Bagration still kept command over their respective armies. Just as Napoleon foresaw, Moscow was too important for Kutuzov not to offer a fight. Heavy rains and mud almost cancelled the French advance, but by September, the Grande Armée was before Borodino, where the Russians waited behind hastily built defenses. With little time left for maneuver, Napoleon again launched a frontal assault on September the 8th, largely destroying Second Army and forcing First to withdraw. A greater victory might have been won had the elite guards been thrown into the fray. But by...
when we were covering the Battle of Borodino with, again, I'm sorry I keep bringing up Epic History TV, but that's kind of when we watched all of this first and really got to know in depth. But, Napoleon's Napoleon. And I very rarely, if ever, question him, because how are you going to question Napoleon, right? He's like one of the you could argue the greatest commander general of all time. But like, when we were watching it, I was kind of like, well, for starters, obviously hindsight, but also his strategy, nothing fancy, right? Just no maneuvers, just go in, full frontal assault. And the reason I remember saying, I think the reason I was hesitant about that is because when we were watching that series, every time a frontal assault happens, that's where most people die. So Napoleon's entire plan was frontal assault, and, it resulted in, obviously, this being the bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars, and it makes sense. And there were calls he made. Like, for once, I think he mentioned that Davout was talking about flanking them. Like, he wanted to go on a flanking maneuver, but Napoleon said no to him. And, I think someone was telling me, like, well, Napoleon wanted a decisive battle, completely break them, and a flank might have made them retreat even further, so Napoleon figured maybe just a frontal assault was the best way to go about it. And yeah, another thing that was kind of questionable, I remember, like, first him not listening to Davout's strategy, regardless if it would have worked or not, still, you know, as we know what happened in actual time, it ended up being a very bloody affair, so who knows. But, next was his hesitance to, send in the guard. And on one hand, I'm fine, you know, obviously Napoleon was super, hesitant to use the guard. He was very reserved. And that's fine, I get that completely, but I feel like, in my opinion, a little too reserved. You know, maybe he should have, like, then again, you know, they were useful in the retreat, but, so, you know, but I don't know, like, I think when his marshals were practically begging him to send in the guard, and Napoleon just kept refusing them, it's like, I don't know, maybe he should have, like, you're already going all out with the frontal assault, you might as well send in your best, right? But, again, I guess that's kind of I imagine people would have different opinions, even I'm a bit iffy about it, but I don't know, I just think maybe he may have been a bit too reserved with the guard. Like, probably could have used them a bit more, in my opinion, you know, obviously, but then again, I'm not a military genius. I'm not Napoleon, I'm just some dude kind of watching this with very amateur knowledge. I don't want to ever come across like I know better, because I don't. I'm not a military man, I'm not any of that, it's just, I'm just speaking from hindsight and knowing what happens. Maybe Napoleon could have been a little less reserved with the guard. Just a little, you know. I don't know. Maybe use them, but then again, you know, I don't know.
Then the Emperor had already made his point. The Russians could no longer realistically defend Moscow. In any case, with a third of his army consumed by Borodino, Napoleon needed to keep the guard fresh to repel any new attacks. Within a week, the French were at Moscow. There was nothing Kutuzov could do, save hold a conference where all the generals, except the mortally wounded Bagration, agreed to bear collective responsibility for abandoning the city. The Russians headed south, eventually settling at the fortified camp of Tarutino to wait for winter.
You know, it was Kutuzov, right, who kind of made the overall call to abandon Moscow, I think, or it seems like it was more of a team effort, but either way, a very tough, controversial call, right, because of just the importance of Moscow. So basically, you know, letting the enemy kind of have it, obviously they burned it, you know, because, but still, like, the symbolic gesture, right, of letting the enemy kind of have it, I think was not popular, obviously. A very tough call to make. But in a weird way, it kind of worked. Like, Napoleon ended up, like, you know, basically waiting there, waiting for the Tsar to mail him back. And he kind of, like, you know, kind of missed a chance, because eventually winter comes, and then the Kutuzov and the Russians essentially harass Napoleon and really kick his butt as he's leaving. So in a weird way it worked out, though obviously it was a tough call to make. But yeah, in a weird way it worked out, right? You know, though obviously symbolically it was not a great thing for, you know, the Russians.
100,000 French marched into a half-empty Moscow on September the 14th. Napoleon had hoped to make use of local officials, but they had all left alongside Kutuzov. There was therefore little attempt to organize the many supplies still left in the city, even after the great fire that raged in the following days. In any case, having reached the operational objective of his entire campaign, Napoleon sunk into strategic complacency, fully believing that peace was imminent and withdrawal preparation would only delay Alexander's response.
Yeah, another one of Napoleon's more questionable behaviors. Yeah, I feel like Napoleon was full of very questionable decision-making during this campaign. A lot that you can see, a lot of blunders. Not all Napoleon's fault, you know, but yeah, he made a lot of... His behavior, I said, when we were watching this through the Epic History series, I was like, Napoleon's behavior during the Russian invasion is so weird to me. It's like, I don't know why, it's just very different from the usual Napoleon. Like, he made a lot of mistakes, a lot of oversights, I think. I felt like there was a lack of urgency on his part, regarding things, and then here, you know, the whole, well, I guess we won, I guess we'll just wait for the Tsar, and then he ends up waiting until he essentially gets his army trapped in the winter. And, yeah, I just feel like Napoleon made a lot of weird decisions, and his, like, behavior was really weird to me during this point. You know? Like, I don't know, just like, before this, and even after this, Napoleon wasn't like, I don't know, like this, I don't know how else to put it, guys. I hope you can kind of get what I'm getting at. Napoleon was weird in this campaign. I don't know, like, I don't know, he was very different from every other campaign that we've witnessed Napoleon. And, yeah.
The response was actually already occurring in the form of partisan warfare. Rather than the standard picture of a people's guerrilla war, partisan in 1812 meant small-scale military raids supported by local guides or militia. Russian Cossacks, in particular, roamed around Moscow and the road to Smolensk, killing French foragers and reducing the French supply flow to a trickle. Nevertheless, the French infantry were fine in Moscow. It was the horses who starved in great numbers. Within a month, only 15% of the cavalry mounts were still alive, and the draft animals for the artillery and baggage weren't faring any better. Sensing major trouble, Napoleon actually pled for peace, sacrificing any hope of bending Russia to his will. The Tsar again did not respond. Instead, the Russians now mounted conventional attacks on the French, raising the specter of the dreaded winter offensive. On October 19th, Napoleon finally acknowledged that no peace was forthcoming, and he needed to make for Smolensk and perhaps try again in 1813. The French left Moscow with 95,000 men. The Russian attack...
Yeah, the most famous part of this invasion, the one where Napoleon basically gets his butt kicked as he's trying to get out of this very awful and precarious situation. And man, did he get led so deep into the territory. Though obviously he always wanted to threaten Moscow, but yeah, from then on it's just a complete disaster. like I said, I think this might be Napoleon at his lowest. Like, this campaign might have been Napoleon at his lowest, and not, yeah, I mean, granted, you know, he does lose the War of the Sixth Coalition. You could argue that's his lowest because he gets kicked out, but, I don't know, I think personally the Russian invasion was probably in my opinion, Napoleon's kind of like, lowest point in terms of just how he came in there with so much strength and left with basically nothing. You know, like what, less than 100,000 men left Russia, so... And also, this is kind of what broke the camel's back to, you know, because the moment he got out and everyone else in Europe noticed how much his army had basically been broken, that kind of what leads to the Sixth Coalition. So I feel safe, in my opinion, calling the Russian invasion Napoleon's lowest point. Yeah.
Attacks were the first step in their planned winter offensive along the entire front. The general idea was for the flank armies to drive their French counterparts away from Napoleon, then help the advancing Kutuzov encircle the emperor. Kutuzov's reinforced force now was actually larger than Napoleon's at 100,000. He had also ejected de Tolly and consolidated control over his command. Nevertheless, Kutuzov remained skeptical about his chances in battle. Some of the new militiamen did not even have muskets, and furthermore, his own supply was not particularly reliable. The prospect of confronting Napoleon's guard in sparse Belarus did not appeal to him at all. As Napoleon marched south on an alternative road back to Smolensk, Kutuzov tested his thesis by sending a corps to block the French at Maloyaroslavets. The Russians were shunted aside, confirming Kutuzov's fears that the French were still powerful. But Napoleon was also spooked by the Russian move. With most of his cavalry gone, he could not risk blindly marching into unfamiliar territory where Kutuzov could possibly outmaneuver him. So the Emperor decided to make for Smolensk, using his original route. The Grande Armée began to march at an intense pace. Soldiers who couldn't keep up simply fell out of the ranks, becoming victims to exposure or to the Cossacks. Soon, entire formations were dissolving into crowds of stragglers, any semblance of discipline destroyed amidst the frozen corpses and abandoned baggage. To Napoleon's credit, this pace was indeed too fast for Kutuzov's liking, who cautiously shadowed the French from the south. But his vanguards were allowed to vigorously pursue the French, inflicting more chaos on the remaining formations. By the time the French were back at Smolensk in early November, the army only had 40,000 effectives left. Immediately, the local supply depot was sacked by stragglers and soldiers alike, ruining any attempt by Napoleon to rally his force. He could do little but resume the retreat soon after, with the French running through a Russian artillery gauntlet Kutuzov had set up. Two more obstacles now stood between Napoleon and his next main depot at Minsk: the Dnieper River at Orsha and the Berezina River at Borisov. But by now, the French flanks were steadily falling back under the pressure of Russian reinforcements. The detachments on the north largely stopped the Russians from coming between them and Napoleon. But in the south, the Austrians simply didn't have enough men to hold off the combined forces of Third Army and the Danube Army, and a Russian force of 35,000 broke through and took Minsk in mid-November. Borisov soon followed, and Napoleon was trapped. The Emperor was at Orsha with 50,000 when he heard the devastating news. In despair, he thought of suicidally flinging his troops against the incoming Russians. But then his scouts luckily found a ford north of Borisov. And by feigning a march south, Napoleon successfully misled the Russians for a critical few days. Between November 24th and 26th, Napoleon sacrificed his engineers to build 2 bridges across the Berezina.
Yeah, one of the most brutal points is the engineers who ended up building in the freezing water, basically getting themselves killed to save the rest of the army, which is insane. I'm like, oh my gosh. Talk about sacrifice. And just, yeah, like I said, Napoleon just getting his butt kicked. Like, the bad logistics, the questionable calls in terms of strategy, the lacks of urgency in certain situations, it just all piled, just mistake after mistake, until it piled to Napoleon's just humiliating defeat. And it is shocking to see, you know, we do hail Napoleon as one of the greatest of all time, and he still is. but it is like a disaster of this magnitude from someone who is like one of the greats is like always shocking to see, you know, that this is kind of all falls on Napoleon's shoulders, this entire botched invasion. And at least with the Spanish campaign, he wasn't there a lot of the time with the Peninsula War, but this is all him, you know, this is just his, yeah, just one of the biggest blunders in history, only outdone by Hitler's invasion of the USSR Russia, which is even, you know, yeah, maybe just invading Russia isn't a good idea. Like I said in part 1, maybe we should never invade Russia. Like, you know, if you're gonna fight Russia, maybe don't fight them on their home turf. It never seems to go well for people.
Dina then spent another 20,000 troops, holding them against the returning Russians. Almost all the stragglers became captives in the process, but Napoleon and his officer cadre were spared the same fate. The harrowing escape wasn't entirely over yet. In fact, only now was the winter at its coldest. But by now the Russians had long since abandoned any serious pursuit, with half of Kutuzov's army out of action due to cold and illness. These were the latest casualties of a campaign that would claim about 150,000 Russian lives. From an original force of 600,000 men total, the Grande Armée was reduced to a mere 100,000. Most of these...
Oh my gosh. And that's kind of like I said, the straw that broke the camel's back. Napoleon's entire reign hinged on his military strength, and the moment he lost it at Russia, he lost his throne. I mean, granted, he had chances to win after this, you know. There were chances for him to remain in power, but things didn't play out as well as he probably liked. But like, you know, the reason the Sixth Coalition happens and that he becomes threatened is mainly this is it, you know, the moment everyone sees, oh, Napoleon has lost. I joked that after Russia, the Grande Armée is no longer grand, it's just the Armée, you know? And, it's kind of true. I mean, I was joking when I say that, but it's kind of just a fact. The Grande Armée is just kind of like, it's no longer the same. It's after Russia, you know? And, yeah, just one of the biggest blunders by one of the greatest, like, commanders of all time, and yeah, it's just kind of hard to defend Napoleon at this point. And I like Napoleon, I really do, but yeah, like I said, I was kind of, throughout this entire invasion, I'm personally more sympathetic to the Russians, because I feel like the Russians, Napoleon kind of alienated them as his ally, kind of did damage to their economy, and, you know, was the more aggressive of the two. So I kind of, like I said, in regards to this, I have more sympathy towards the Russian side than I do Napoleon, and yeah.
Being reservists who had not even entered Russia. Of the 450,000 men of Napoleon's Central Army, only 20,000 would recross the Niemen back into Prussia on December 11th. Napoleon had already left for Paris a week before, with plans to raise a new army for the wars of 1813. Napoleon had suffered a devastating loss, but not a mortal blow. In 1813, using the officers he had saved at the Berezina, Napoleon raised a new army of 700,000, leading 200,000 of these to fight Prussia and Russia. But unlike 1806, this time the Russians started off right next to the Prussian army. Their combined resistance would eventually encourage Austria to join the anti-French coalition, and Napoleon would not just lose his hegemony over Central Europe, but by 1814, his throne as well. Napoleon's Russian campaign saw both France and Russia deploy atypical war strategies. However, Napoleon fared worse under the new circumstances as compared to Alexander. This was partly because Alexander's obstacles to defensive war were merely political, while Napoleon's plan to use pre-industrial methods to supply a long-distance offensive stretched the laws of logistics, though his system held out until Moscow. Behind this was a fundamental strategic miscalculation as to what it would take to bring Russia to heel. A limited or multi-phased war might have delivered better results. In the end, by trying to achieve everything at once, Napoleon set himself on the road to ruin.
Yep. that aptly describes why his strategy didn't work, right? He really wanted that decisive, quick, okay, let's get them battle, but yeah, this, like I said, probably strategically Napoleon's, like, biggest disaster.
If you stayed around this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment as a sacrifice. As always, we'll see.
So yes, a great two-parter series. You know, this was very enlightening, and I feel like I have, it's nice to get a deeper view. I mean, we kind of covered what went wrong, right? In part one, I kind of explained the general things that went wrong with this campaign, but it's nice to get a deeper look into Napoleon's strategic vision that wasn't, first of all, he underestimated the Russian resolve, and two, he didn't seem to have the system to support the fast-moving war he wanted. He wanted like a decisive, quick war as a part of his usual strategy, but obviously that wasn't gonna happen. Also with Russian resolve, some blunders in terms of like maneuvering, just yeah, and like I said, the logistics problem. It just all came back to bite Napoleon, didn't it? Yeah. Still, it was... Like I said, I think personally, Napoleon's lowest moment, because I think this is kind of what snowballs his defeat, you know? Inevitable loss of power completely. So, yeah. I don't really have much else to add other than, another great Napoleon series, and stay tuned every Tuesday for more Napoleon related content, and also stick around for my many other days. We cover many series Monday through Fridays on this channel, so plenty more history to cover. With that said, I'll see you on the next one. Bye everyone.